In 1953, a man named Sir Edmund Hillary reached the peak of Mount Everest. He became the first person to ever do this. In one of his basically reports on this, he talked about how the first thing that he did when he got to the peak of Everest was actually looking for evidence of a man named George Mallory. Now, that may not make a whole ton of sense. Why was the first person to ever scale Mount Everest looking for another person at the peak of Mount Everest? That's because the story is actually a little more complex than that. The real thing that happened was 30 years before Sir Edmund Hillary, a man named George Mallory might have actually scaled the peak of Everest. So, George Mallory was a British climber who was a really, really good climber. And in 1922, he decided to join an expedition that was looking to reach the peak of Mount Everest. On this expedition, George Mallory actually became the leader, and after 2 unsuccessful attempts, George Mallory really pushed for a 3rd attempt to happen, even though most people thought it was a little too dangerous at the time. That's because it was during a 10-day period when you could actually go to the peak of Mount Everest, and they were getting pretty close to the end of that 10-day period. George Mallory kind of pushed to do it anyway, and it would end in tragedy. Now, what happened was there was actually an avalanche that ended up taking 7 people's lives. Now, you might be thinking, oh, was one of them George Mallory? No, actually, one of them was not George Mallory. George Mallory turned out to be fine, and the 7 people who died were mainly Sherpas who work in the area and work to help people move things. But he was criticized a lot in that 1922 expedition. All of the information that I got on that was basically from a 1922 report on the expedition that was written by pretty much everyone who was a part of the expedition. In 1924, George Mallory would get the chance to try to scale the peak of Everest again. After a couple of failed attempts, basically, once everyone tried to do their final attempt, once they got to the highest camp, the closest camp near the peak, basically nobody was well enough or had enough energy to actually scale the peak of Everest except for George Mallory and another man named Sandy Irvine. So the two had an ill-advised attempt to the summit peak. In this attempt, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine would never be seen again. In the 1924 expedition's report, a man named Norton Odell would talk about how he was the last person to have ever seen them. He was photographing everything, and the last he had ever seen of George Mallory and Sandy Irvine was when he was looking up at the peak and he saw 2 little dots that were really, really close to the actual summit peak. This was the last that anyone had ever seen them. Eventually, mist had blocked the view of Norton Odell, and after that, nobody would ever see them again. The only information that we would get on the topic was actually 75 years later, when in 1999, another expedition to Everest found George Mallory's body. On George Mallory's body, they were looking for 2 things. They were looking for a photo of Ruth Mallory, which was in possession of George Mallory, and his plan was to actually put it at the peak of Everest. The other thing that they were looking for was a photo camera that George Mallory had. If they found the camera, then they would have taken a photo at the peak of Everest for sure. Neither of these things were actually found on George Mallory. The photo being missing was really interesting because that would suggest that maybe he did reach the peak, but they aren't totally sure because it very well could have been lost in his fall. The big thing that wasn't there was the camera. So the camera is now believed to be on the body of Sandy Irvin, because they still to this day have not found Sandy Irvin's body. That is the real big hope, is that one day the body of Sandy Irving will be found, and hopefully it will have this camera that will basically prove that they got to the peak. So basically, whether you believe Sandy Irving and George Mallory actually reached the summit peak was whether you believe that they were willing to die for it, whether you believe that they had summit fever. George Mallory was one of those people that, it seemed like maybe he would die to get to the peak of Everest. And I'll leave you with a quote that is one of the most famous in mountaineering. When asked, why do you want to get to the peak of Mount Everest, George Mallory simply said, because it's there, which kind of puts into perspective the way that he viewed challenges like getting to the peak of Mount Everest. So, thank you.